The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in
Good
listen-only
morning,
mode.
everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We have Ann Douglas this morning, and today Ann will talk about coping strategies for parents who have a child who is struggling with a mental, neurodevelopmental, or behavioral challenge. She will include self-care, self-compassion, creating your own support network, and lifestyle matters, nutrition, fitness, sleep, stress management, and making time for fun. Her presentation is based on interviews with more than 50 parents who have walked this walk and who are eager to share their best advice with other parents. These interviews form the basis for Ann's latest book, Parenting Through the Storm: How to Handle the Highs, the Lows, and Everything in Between. Ann is the author also of Parenting Through the Storm, and numerous other books about parenting, including the bestseller The Mother of All Pregnancy Books. She is also a mother of 4 children who have struggled with a variety of different mental health, neurodevelopmental, and behavioral challenges, and who are currently all thriving. She is a passionate and inspiring speaker, leads small group workshops at health, parenting, and education conferences, and she has created and delivered numerous parenting courses. Welcome, Ann. We're so happy to have you this morning.
Well, I am so happy to be here, Debbie. I think this is the very kind of conversation that I would have benefited from so much when my children were first diagnosed and I was feeling so frightened, so worried, so overwhelmed. And of course, I say conversation when at the first part of this, it will be me talking a lot, and then we will get into question and answer a little later on. So I just wanted to start out by sort of recognizing the fact that every child is different, every family is different, but that there are elements of our journey that we share in common when our child is diagnosed with a mental health, neurodevelopmental, or behavioral challenge. So I think there's stuff that is different and there's stuff that's the same, and that thread I think will be woven throughout my presentation today. For starters, I just wanted to start out with 2 quotes that I find really inspiring. I actually included these at the beginning of my book because I just felt that people needed to see them. So let's just go through those. The oak fought the wind and was broken. The willow bent when it must and survived. I think that quote from Robert Jordan really speaks to what it's like to be a parent in a family where a child is struggling. Sometimes you feel like it's going to break you, but in the end, you learn how to deal with the challenge and how to survive. The next quote. This one sent shivers up my spine when I first found it, and I think it will be equally powerful for you. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what this storm is all about. So you have embarked on a transformative kind of journey as a family. It's not one you necessarily volunteered for or signed yourself up for, but you're on it, and this experience will change you in powerful ways. And it will strengthen you as well. So it would be really strange for me to do a presentation like this without talking a little bit about my family's story. So I want to take you at first back to a time when things were pretty terrible, and then I want to jump forward to the present when things are pretty great for my kids. I want you to know that things can get a lot better for your child and your family. It's so important to hear this when your child and your family are going through a really, really rough time. So 2003 was like the worst ever year for our family. I should introduce you to the family members. If you're looking at this slide of my family, that's my daughter Julie at the end, my husband Neil next to her, our son Scott, who's the second born, the baby Ian, who's in the plaid shirt, our son Eric, who's our third born, and then of course me at the end. So as I mention these various characters, you can see what they look like today. So back in 2003, Julie was 15 and in grade 10. The depression she'd been struggling with for a couple of years had morphed into something angrier and much more hostile. She developed an eating disorder, she was using drugs, and it would be another decade before she was diagnosed and treated for ADHD, the diagnosis that she believes is the right one for her. Scott was in grade 9 and going through the motions at home and at school. His ADHD was definitely affecting his academics and his relationships. Eric, the guy next to me, was in grade 7 and experiencing a lot of angry outbursts. He was coping with ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and a learning disability that made it very difficult for him to write. I remember once he brought home his homework in grade 5, and I read through it, and I realized to my utter despair that he didn't understand what capital letters were for. He didn't understand how to use punctuation. And I thought, how am I going to help this kid? How is it possible that this young man will someday be able to get through high school? I was so worried. And then Ian, at that point, the big guy in the middle, he was just the baby at this point back in 2003. He was 6, and he was having a huge amount of trouble in grade 1. He was suspended 6 times that year, and I remember thinking at the time, how can this be possible? How can a child be suspended in grade 1? This doesn't make any sense at all. This is the age when your teacher's supposed to adore you, and you're supposed to adore your teacher, and everything was going terribly, terribly wrong. It took us 4 schools and 4 more years before we got a diagnosis and a good school situation in place for Ian. At that point, he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is a type of autism spectrum disorder, as well as ADHD and a writing-related disability. So he was dealing with a lot. I'm going to now tell you a little bit about how great things are in the present, because I think that you really need to know that if your children are struggling hugely right now, that things can get so much better than you might ever imagine in the future. So Julie, the one I was so worried about because of her eating disorder and her depression, at one point I had 2 goals for her. I hoped that she would A, live, and B, finish high school. I am thrilled to be able to report that she graduated from university. She has a degree in photography, and she's an emerging young artist. She specializes in the beauty in broken and abandoned things. And I think that's really significant for somebody who's had her journey. Then Scott, my guy in the blue shirt there, he was totally absent-minded when he was growing up. He was the kid who would arrive home from school and forget to wear his shoes home, and I thought, what are we going to do with this guy? He also was like a brilliant kind of genius guy. And I remember thinking at one point, will he use his brains for good or for evil? Well, I'm happy to report that he's doing extremely well. He found his passion, which is in the computer industry, and he's currently working in Ireland in the computer industry. When he first graduated, I got a note from his first ever employer saying, thank you for the gift that is this young man. You have done a remarkable job of raising a creative, hardworking, passionate individual, and it went on. And I just remember having tears in my eyes and thinking, somebody really gets and appreciates my child. It was an amazing, amazing moment. Then there's Eric, the guy who's next to me in this photo. He is the one that I was worried about because of his writing disability, that he might never make it through high school. Well, I am thrilled to report that Eric not only made it through high school, he graduated from college, then he upgraded up here in Canada where we live. He upgraded with a university degree, and now he is pursuing a professional designation in the accounting field, and by all reports, he is rocking his licensing exams. So I'm very, very proud of him as well. And then there's the baby, who at 17 loves it when I call him the baby. Ian is in his last year of high school. He is in an apprenticeship program for young people that is giving him on-the-job experience so that he can pursue his dream of becoming an auto mechanic. This is really significant because I remember when he first got his Asperger's syndrome diagnosis, I remember doing some online research and coming up with some really scary kind of statistics and foreboding kind of warnings that said things like, your child will never have a relationship, your child will never have a job. And I took that to heart so much. So I am pleased to report that he has had a relationship, not one that lasted forever, as is often the case when you're a teenager, and that he has had his first job. So all of my worries about him not being able to function in the world have been blown away simply by the fact that he is doing so well today. So that's a little bit about my family, but enough about my family. Let's talk about things that you need to know and that would be helpful to your family. So I've come up with a list based on my research for my book of 7 things other parents want you to know about parenting a child who is struggling. The first thing you really need to know is that you and your child are not alone. I know it can feel that way, but it's not the case. The problem is that it's so much more difficult for us to be honest and open about our struggles and our children's struggles as our kids get older. It's not like when your child is a baby. Everybody understands that it's really hard work to have a newborn and to be sleep deprived and so on. It's so much more difficult to talk about how much your school-age child or your teenager is struggling, in part because there aren't the same kind of supports automatically in place in your neighborhood. You may also be worried about violating your child's privacy as he gets older. I think it's possible to be respectful of your child's privacy and still tap into the support you need to do a good job as a parent. Social media, of course, makes it so much more difficult when your child is struggling. It's hard to be honest about the struggles that your child is going through when it seems like everybody else is sharing perfect family moments on Facebook. As one of the parents I interviewed for my book pointed out, people only post the happy stuff. They're not going to start snapping selfies when their kid is mid-meltdown or when their child is being called to the principal's office. The good news is that support is available. There are other people who understand, probably in your own circle of friends, and also through organizations like the one that is supporting this webinar today. I was really lucky to have 3 close friends who'd been through similar experiences with their kids, and they were incredible sources of support and wisdom to me, whether it was responding to a late night email or text message or having lunch with me to hear me talk about how upset I was and how worried I was. These women were there for me in spades. I hope you have people like that in your life as well. The second thing you need to know if you are the parent of a child who is struggling is that having a child who is struggling doesn't make you a bad parent, just as being a child who is struggling doesn't make your child a bad kid. It just means that you're going through a difficult time as a family, that this is the particular challenge that your family is facing. Of course, the challenges can feel overwhelming. Children who are struggling with a mental health, neurodevelopmental, or behavioral disorder may experience difficulties at school, both with academics and with their relationships with teachers and peers. They may find it hard to make friends, and they may exhibit extreme behavior at home. Bullying is another concern, with children who are struggling being more likely to bully and to become victims of bullying. Research indicates that bullying is a relationship problem, so it explains why children who may be struggling with relationship skills are more likely to be bullies or bullied. School suspensions are common when a child is struggling. If schools don't know how to respond to a child's behavior or they don't have adequate resources in place, they may resort to repeated suspensions, which can create a lot of chaos and stress for both the child and the family. Parents who have a child who is struggling often feel stressed and overwhelmed and unsure of what to do to help. They worry about their kids. They feel judged and misunderstood. They feel lonely. They feel frustrated and angry. They feel sad that life is so difficult for their child. They feel so many things, sometimes all at the same time. The third thing you really need to know if you have a child who is struggling is it's so important to reach out for help as soon as you begin to suspect that there could be a problem. Parents need to know that waiting lists for diagnosis and treatment are long, so it's important to reach out for support and referrals sooner rather than later if you suspect that there could be a problem. Sometimes parents say, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I get my child on all these waiting lists and it turns out that there isn't anything wrong? Well, what a wonderful problem to have people say, actually, your child is doing just fine, but thanks for checking it out. Nobody will judge you for being a committed and caring parent and getting that opinion. They'll actually applaud you for doing so. And it certainly beats the alternative, which is not getting on the right waiting list soon enough and watching your child and your family continue to struggle while you play a waiting game. So err on the side of caution where these kind of things are concerned. If your parent radar is telling you that something's not right, pay attention to that feeling and start looking for help for your child and your family. The fourth thing you really need to know if your child is struggling is that you don't have to wait until your child has a definitive diagnosis before you start trying to make things better for your child and your family. There are things you can do starting right now while you're waiting for diagnosis or treatment, like using parenting techniques that bring out the best as opposed to the worst in your child, becoming a strong advocate for your child, working on your own coping and stress management skills, and teaching these kind of skills to your child, and encouraging yourself and your kids to make healthy living a priority. So let's talk about some of these strategies in more detail, because I think this is the stuff that can make a difference in your life starting today. Let's talk first about parenting strategies. The 4 strategies that I'm going to talk about will be helpful to you whether you have a child who is struggling a little or a lot. They'll also help you to manage your own stress level, which is key to making it possible for you to help your child. So the first strategy is so simple. Just ask yourself, what does my child need from me right now? Parenting can be exhausting, and meeting the needs of a child who's angry or upset can require an extraordinary amount of patience. You'll find it's easier to be patient with your child if you pause to ask yourself, what does my child need right now? This simple question really cuts to the chase of things by helping you to shift your focus from how you are feeling to what you can do to make things better. So you cut through all that emotion and you move into solution mode. The second strategy that I think is very powerful is to validate your child's feelings. Validating your child's feelings means just letting your child know that what she is thinking and feeling makes sense, even if you don't share that exact same perspective yourself. You might tell your child, for example, that it makes sense that she's afraid of thunderstorms. Everybody is afraid of sudden loud noises. Validating your child's emotions will encourage her to accept her feelings rather than trying to avoid them. And it is an effective strategy for calming an upset child. Think about what it's like as an adult when somebody validates your feelings versus when somebody doesn't validate your feelings. We've all been through the experience of having a really bad day at work and coming home and talking to a family member and saying something like, oh, my boss was so unreasonable and this happened and that happened. And then if your partner says to you, but honey, don't you think you were being a little unreasonable? Don't you think maybe your boss was in the right? Well, suddenly you're no longer upset. You are completely livid and out of control. The same thing happens with kids. If we don't understand the emotion that is driving what they're saying and thinking and feeling, then they don't feel like they're being heard or understood, and then that makes them really upset. So just try to focus on validating your child's feelings. Just saying to your child, I understand that you feel that way. Sometimes parents are reluctant to do this because they think that their child will think that they're endorsing a behavior that they don't agree with. Let's say, for example, that your high school student decides to cope with the stress of an upcoming math test by skipping that math test. Not the best strategy. You don't need to get into the talking about how it wasn't the greatest decision to make right away. What you can do is say to your child, I understand how awful it feels to know you have to take a test when you feel totally unprepared. You might even share an example of how you felt when you took your driver's license for the first time and you were convinced you were going to fail and how scary that was. Your child will then know that you understand the emotions that they're grappling with. And feeling understood allows your child to take a deep breath and then move on eventually into solution mode with you. That's when you talk about what you can do about the math test that didn't get written. Of course, listening isn't a skill that comes naturally to us in our culture. We have a tendency to focus more on getting our own message out as opposed to listening to what the other person has to say. And children are geniuses at picking up on when we aren't really listening. So just remind yourself to really connect with your child, to mirror his or her emotions, and to accept those emotions. And you'll find that this is an incredibly helpful parenting strategy. The third strategy I want to talk about is the importance of being a calming presence in your child's life. It's interesting. We know when we're dealing with babies how to help calm them with our calming presence. So if you have a baby who's crying, you'll pick up the baby and you'll sway them back and forth in your arms and you'll say all kinds of soothing things, and your child will be soothed by your tone and by the motion. Sometimes we forget that even bigger kids need help in calming their emotions by being in the presence of another calm individual. Of course, the challenge here is that as parents, we have to get ourselves into that calm state in order to be able to calm another child. We also have to remind ourselves that this co-regulation or emotional meeting of minds isn't just for babies. I'm sure you've noticed times when your older child has turned to you for support and for help in calming emotions. I remember when my youngest was about 10, sometimes he would make an excuse to sort of want to snuggle up on the couch and watch TV, and it was really just a way to want to lean against me and fall asleep against me and enjoy that love and connection. And when you're 10, sometimes you just don't go up and say, I need a hug right now. You look for other ways of getting it, right? So over time, your goal is, of course, to teach your child how to regulate their own emotions. But the best way to do this is by modeling this themselves. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call mindful parenting. Parenting is basically making parenting decisions with your big picture goals for your child and your family in mind. That way, the parenting decisions you make in the moment are more likely to be in sync with your parenting values. It doesn't mean that you don't sometimes experience powerful emotions like anger or frustration. What it means is that you pause to consider whether expressing these emotions will achieve the best possible results for yourself and your child. Does this mean we have to be perfect? Of course not. And it's a good thing, because otherwise there wouldn't be any parents. What it means is that you keep trying and you keep reminding yourself that you do have big picture parenting goals for yourself and your child. And while you are modeling this skill of making mindful decisions, you're helping to model this behavior for your child, who can then eventually begin to learn how to make conscious and deliberate choices in their own life. The final point I want to talk to in this section about parenting strategies is the importance of practicing self-compassion. Self-compassion basically just means treating yourself with the same kind of kindness that you would extend to a friend who is struggling. It's funny, you know, if your friend is going through a hard time with their child, you're not going to go up to them and say, you're the worst parent in the world. Boy, you really blew that. And yet sometimes those really judgmental, self-critical messages pop up in our own head when we feel like we've blown it as a parent. If you can shift the dialogue to say to yourself, I'm doing the best I can in a very difficult situation, you'll find that a couple of amazing things begin to happen. First of all, you'll be able to focus on what you need to do to make things better for yourself. If you're thinking, I am totally wiped today, I didn't get enough sleep last night, and if you're being kind and compassionate to yourself, you'll say, okay, well, this is probably not a great day to try and renegotiate the mortgage at the bank. Let's postpone that task for a little while and cut yourself some slack, just like you would encourage a friend to do. You also, when you're treating yourself with self-compassion, you automatically default to a more compassionate attitude towards others. Being kinder to yourself encourages you to be kinder to yourself and less judgmental of other people in the world. We're able to sort of understand that everybody has a struggle. Most people are doing the best they can in a difficult situation, and so if somebody cuts you off in line at the grocery store, then you're probably going to give that person the benefit of the doubt and assume that they weren't trying to be deliberately evil. They were just distracted by something else, and they didn't really notice you were there, or they were too caught up worrying about a family member to be as polite as maybe they could be. Okay, going to change slides here. Now let's talk a little bit about advocacy skills. I think it's so important for you to be an advocate on behalf of your child when your child is dealing with a mental health, neurodevelopmental, or behavioral challenge. your child is counting on you to help to ensure that they're able to tap into the supports and be treated with kindness and so on. So first of all, the first thing you really need to know is that it's important to take a solutions-oriented approach when you're advocating for your child at school and in the community. I know our grandmothers always used to say, you get treated better if you treat other people better. It's so true. Because if you think what it's like to be that social worker or that teacher and you get a call from a parent, if the parent immediately goes on the attack, you're going to feel less inclined to want to be helpful than if the person comes up with a kinder, gentler, and solution-oriented approach where they say, you know what, I am really, really worried about my child, and I'm hoping we can figure out some strategies to make things better for my child at school. And maybe the parent can even take things one step further and say, you know, I heard about exercise balls in the classroom, and I was thinking that with my kid being so wiggly, maybe that would be something we could try. So you're bringing a concrete idea to the table. Also being willing to listen to the other person's point of view and to assume the best intention of other people, so that you're in a collaborative kind of mind frame as opposed to an adversarial kind of mind frame. At the same time, to the degree that it's possible, given your child's age and ability, you want to teach your child how to self-advocate, how to speak up for themselves, because over the decades, you are not always going to be by their side. So they need to learn this kind of skill over time. So it can be just a case of teaching your child how to respectfully ask for help from other people so that they don't get other people's backs up, and encouraging your child to speak up when there are situations where they feel that they're falling through the cracks or they're not being treated with respect and so on. So sometimes your child has a really hard time advocating for themselves. And in that case, you just want to make sure that you're being your child's voice. Maybe before you go for a parent-teacher interview, you talk to your child at home and say, you know, what kind of ideas would you like me to bring to the table, assuming, of course, that your child won't automatically be part of that meeting. So just think about your job as a parent as being to be your child's voice and advocate. Even for a child who maybe can't express their needs verbally, don't underestimate how much you know about your child and how much wisdom you bring to the table when you're in meetings with experts who, yes, have a lot of clinical expertise and a lot of other skills to bring to the table, but nobody else has had the joy and privilege of getting to know your child for as long or as intensely as you have. Now let's talk a little bit about stress management and coping skills. And I always feel like I need to preface this part of the discussion by pointing out that, like everybody else, there were times when I failed massively at stress management and coping skills. In fact, at one point, I was doing such a bad job of taking care of myself and managing my stress that I wasn't sleeping well, and I was eating too much in order to come up with a source of energy, and I gained about 100 pounds, which I had to work really, really hard to lose. So that's why, as we're talking about self-management and stress management and coping skills, and then in a moment about lifestyle as well, if it sounds like I'm kind of like a passionate evangelist for this stuff, it's because I know how awful it feels to totally burn out and fry, and I don't want you to have to go through that if you can avoid it. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of stress management skills. I didn't know until a couple of years ago that as humans, our default emotional setting is a little bit negative. Now this makes sense when you think back about prehistoric times. If you were walking around in the woods and you heard a rustle, it made sense for your brain to go into worst case scenario mode, to assume that a tiger was about to jump out and eat you. It doesn't make quite as much sense today to always be thinking of the worst or the negative and to be in that kind of default setting. So what I learned a couple of years ago is that we can change our default emotional setting from always negative and drained and feeling horrible to feeling much more positive. And the best way to do this is to get your brain to spend more time in the emotional state you desire. So if you want to feel happier automatically, do things to boost the amount of time you spend feeling happy. So for some people, it will be going for a walk or exercising or going out with a friend or, doing a favorite kind of hobby or activity. Treat this as essential stuff. This is stuff you have to do to thrive as a parent. So there's that part about boosting positive emotion. We also have to know how to push down or get rid of or dispel negative emotion. I discovered a few years ago that one of the best ways that I can cope with my anxiety is by going for a couple of brisk walks per day. So if I'm feeling really stressed out, I'm a writer, so sometimes I'm looking at that blank screen and I'm thinking, I'm never going to find the words to write this thing. The best thing I can do is go for a brisk walk around the block, and it just helps to release that anxiety so I can then settle down and deal with the situation at hand. We need to help coach our children on these skills. None of us are born with the operating manual for ourselves in our hand, knowing exactly how to optimize our human experience. So we have to help kids to figure out some of that, and we have to recognize that what works for us may not be the same strategy that works for our child. So think about that. Think about your knowledge of your child, and think about what you can do to help yourself and your child to develop coping strategies that are effective, and work on those on an ongoing basis. Don't expect perfection overnight, and if you find yourself messing up, remember what we talked about earlier with self-compassion, because you do want to be kind and patient with yourself. There's a learning curve involved. Okay, let's talk now about physical health and making physical health a priority. As I told you a few minutes ago, I really bottomed out when my children were struggling. I got totally depleted. I don't want you to have to get totally depleted. So a couple of points that I would just stress. Sleep is essential. You can't burn the candle at both ends and expect to be able to have your mood or your coping ability or even your concentration powers working properly. You have to figure out ways to get the sleep you need. If you have a child who gets up repeatedly in the night, this is really, really hard. You may have to hire a high school student or another support person to come in on a Saturday afternoon and let you take a nap for a couple of hours if that's what it takes to refuel. Because, like I say, sleep is a necessity. Exercise. Now, I come to this exercise thing as somebody who hated gym class. I was that kid who was last picked for everything. So for decades, I had a terrible attitude towards exercise. I thought it was something nasty to be avoided at all costs. Well, in the past couple of years, I've discovered that exercise is what allows me to thrive. Here's some of the benefits. It improves your mood. It reduces your feelings of anxiety. It reduces stress. It improves sleep. Yay. It sparks the formation of new brain cells, and it counters feelings of hopelessness. So if you're a person yourself who is struggling with depression or anxiety, it's so important. Now, I should probably tell you, I thought I was going to do this earlier in the presentation, but maybe I forgot. I live with bipolar 2 disorder. So managing my moods is a key piece of my functioning. So I think that if in your family mood disorders run in the family and you can see it across generations, then exercise needs to be a family-wide strategy where you teach your kids right from day one that exercise is going to allow them to feel so much better and to thrive. Then let's talk a little bit about nutrition. If you get into a rut where you're not sleeping and then you're turning to like high sugar foods for instant energy and so on, you can find yourself riding this blood sugar roller coaster, which only maximizes your mood swings, your irritability, and your fatigue. So we need to think about giving our bodies healthy, long-term sources of fuel, the fuel it needs to function at its best. I don't have time to go into a huge amount on nutrition today, but I just wanted to flag that for you. So think about things like protein and complex carbohydrates and fats. Fats are not the enemy, in moderation, and the right types of fats. So do a little reading on that, and hopefully you can think of some ways of making nutrition really matter in your life. And then let's talk about play. Sometimes parents feel like you can't have time off for good behavior to have fun when your child is struggling. You absolutely need to have time off for good behavior. And play is a good thing for parents and for kids. Play stimulates brain growth. For kids, it provides opportunities for socialization, and for kids who are struggling, working on their social skills. It improves concentration and focus, and it replenishes us. So don't treat play and fun as something that you'll add to your calendar when things get better. Start thinking about ways to integrate play and fun into your life and the life of your family on an ongoing basis. Back to my list of things you really need to know if you're a parent who has a child who is struggling. And this is a big one. You don't have to be afraid of obtaining a diagnosis for your child. Understand that a diagnosis simply provides a snapshot of information about your child. It doesn't need to define or limit your child. Now let's talk about this for a moment. There is a lot of concern about stigma. Parents worry that their child will be labeled, quote unquote, a bad kid, or that people will say unhelpful things about their child's diagnosis or treatment options if their child receives a diagnosis. They also worry about how their child may feel about himself in light of the diagnosis. It is so important to remind yourself and other people that a diagnosis is just a piece of information about your child. It doesn't even begin to describe the unique and complex person that your child is, but it can make life better for your child by providing you with valuable information that allows you to choose parenting strategies that will help to make things better for your child. Based on my experience and the experience of other family members, I would say that the pros of being open about any challenges your child is facing far outweigh the cons. For one thing, people are going to make assumptions about your child, and in the absence of anything more concrete, they may unkindly and unfairly conclude that your child is a bad kid. And your child may have a sense that something's wrong. This may lead him to conclude that there's something wrong with him, that he's somehow defective or unworthy. So it is so important to have a frank and open conversation with your child about how he's feeling and how you can help him to manage those feelings so that he knows he's loved, supported, and that he doesn't have to carry this difficult challenge on his own. Imagine what it feels like to be a child who's struggling and who isn't able to benefit from this kind of frank and open conversation about what's going on. You would feel so terribly alone, and it would be really hard to hold on to hope. Some parents worry that their child will be treated differently as a result of their diagnosis. I think it's important to try to obtain the information you need to make the best possible decisions regarding your child's health. And I think it's worth noting that diagnosis opens the door to all kinds of treatments and supports, including in-school supports that might not otherwise be available to your child. This isn't to say that you don't want to decide to be selective about how much you share about your child's diagnosis and with whom. And you'll definitely want to consider how you share information about your child's diagnosis with your child himself. You want to make sure that your explanation is age appropriate. Specifically, what does this mean and what will it mean in terms of your child's life? And that you let your child know that a diagnosis is nothing more than information that can be used to help them to lead the happiest and healthiest life possible. I think it's also important to give your child a chance to practice responses to unhelpful comments that he might face in the real world, and to reiterate the fact that he can always turn to you for support if he feels that he's encountering stigma. Your child also needs to know that he's not the only person dealing with a mental health challenge. I mean, the estimates are 1 in 4, 1 in 5. A lot of us are dealing with a mental health challenge. So he doesn't have to feel alone, even though sometimes he will at first. He also needs to know that he is not a burden and that you are there to help him. So much to talk about a diagnosis. I think another important point is that a diagnosis can change or evolve over time, just as your child is changing and growing and evolving as he goes through developmental stages. So don't be surprised if your child's diagnosis does evolve, and don't feel that that necessarily means that your family received poor care or anything like that. Sometimes the jury's still out because not all the pieces of the puzzle are in place. The next thing you really need to know if you have a child who is struggling is that it is so important to give yourself permission to continue to experience joy in your life even while your child is struggling. A child who is struggling benefits from having a happy and healthy parent. You can't put your life and happiness on hold until some magical future day when your child will no longer be struggling. You have to do the hard work of finding happiness in your life right now, even while your child is going through a really tough time. It doesn't have to be an either or proposition. You can feel really sad about the difficulties that your child is experiencing while also allowing yourself to continue to experience happiness in your life. And you shouldn't feel guilty for doing things that give you pleasure, like meeting a friend for a cup of coffee or going for a walk on a beautiful day. You're investing in a healthier you, and that will only do good things for your child. A child who is struggling needs the strongest, healthiest parent possible. Finally, it is so important to seek shelter in the storm, to connect with other parents who truly understand the struggles that you're facing and who will share wisdom and offer support. That is why organizations like the International Bipolar Foundation are so important, because you can connect with other parents who are going through a hard time and who have wisdom and expertise to share because they've walked this path. At a broader level, I think we as a society need to commit to supporting parents and children who are struggling. We need to emphasize prevention, to make early childhood screening a priority so that difficulties can be addressed early on. We need to ensure that we're investing enough in child and youth mental health services to ensure that every child who receives a diagnosis is able to access treatment services promptly. It's not okay to simply move a child's name from one waiting list to another. We need to ensure that schools are able to live up to their commitment or their mandate to meet the needs of all children. And we need to have conversations about what it means to live well with a mental illness so that families won't feel frightened by a diagnosis. We need mental health role models who demonstrate every day that it's possible to have a mental illness and a great life. You don't have to choose one or the other. We need to be willing to speak openly about the challenges our children face as they move beyond the baby and toddler years. No parent who has a preteen or a teen who is struggling should feel like they have to suffer in silence. They need to know that they are not alone, that they and their children are embraced, not judged, by the village. I hope you'll join with me in working to create a warm and inclusive village. And for now, let's talk a little bit about some of the issues I've raised in this presentation. So if you have questions, this would be a great time to ask them. I'll let Debbie moderate.
Great, thank you, Anne. While we wait for questions, I will reiterate that this webinar is being recorded. It will be archived on our website for future viewing to share with others that weren't able to attend. I know it's difficult for some, being typically a work hours.
Yeah.
So just waiting for questions. And certainly if there's something that you think of after we end this talk, you can email me at dbrown@ibpf.org, or just go to our website and send an email through the website, and I'd be happy to pass those questions on to Anne. And I'm sure she'd be happy to answer. So
maybe I could start out by answering a question that a lot of parents ask me.
Yes.
And that is, how did your family hold on to hope when you were dealing with all the struggles that your family was going through? And I think that it probably helps that I'm a naturally kind of optimistic person. I may have had problems with depression, but I am still an optimistic person. And then I'm a fairly stubborn person. It just never occurred to me to consider the possibility that my children wouldn't ultimately go on to thrive. That doesn't mean that I wasn't horribly worried at times, and that there weren't days when I cried so hard that I could hardly breathe. You know, when you're sobbing so hard you can't capture air. I remember that feeling and how awful it was. But that seemed to make me more determined to try to support my kids and find them the right supports and everything so that they could go on to thrive. I can honestly say that I didn't lose track of hope, but I also had no idea that my life could be as great today as it is. I don't have a perfect life, but all my kids are doing well and they're happy and they've found their passion. And as a parent, what more can you want but for your child to grow up to be happy and healthy? So I feel like I've won the lottery 4 times over, and I hope for nothing less for your family.
Wow, Anne, thank you for sharing that. That's incredible to hear, and it's what every parent does need to hear. We do have a question, and it reads, I've been hesitant to get my son tested for a diagnosis as we've been going through a divorce. He's witnessed poor anger management from his father, so I was concerned that he would be diagnosed incorrectly. Not sure what the question is. Just a moment. Let me read through this just a moment. Oh, okay. So she just added, do you think he should go to a therapist now or wait, just considering everything that's going on in his life? What's your opinion?
Yeah, it sounds to me like he would benefit from support now because there is a lot going on in the family. And I think sometimes it can feel so awkward and so scary to put our parenting stuff out there in the world, right? Because when your child is going through a really rough time or your family's going through a really rough time, you sometimes aren't at your best. But really caring and on the ball professionals will understand this. I was at a parenting conference last year, and one of the dads stood up and he made an amazing point. He said to all the professionals in the room, if you see our family at the hospital one day when we're in crisis, don't assume that the upset behavior that you're seeing in the moment is how we always function. That's just because we're dealing with a crisis situation. Don't judge us and assume that you know everything about our family. Do the digging. Find out about our strengths. Because sometimes when a child or a family is in crisis, those strengths may not be quite as apparent. So I would just say to find the right person, somebody who's going to look at the whole picture of things and say, yes, there are some immediate challenges right now and the family's going through a hard time because of the divorce, but that doesn't define the whole scope of what's going on. It doesn't pick up on the strengths of the individuals in the family, and it doesn't pick up on any other challenges that maybe need to be addressed. So that would be my advice, to just find somebody who's really going to get it and who's going to work collaboratively and non-judgmentally with your family.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. She did actually type something additional stating that her son is receiving support currently, but it was more about getting a diagnosis as his school is pushing for it. But it seems that he's in a crisis mode at this point. So she just has some concerns about reading the challenges differently in terms of his behavior.
For sure. And plus a diagnosis can definitely evolve over time. So you could have a working diagnosis that would allow your child to tap into some services and supports now. And then if after things settle down, it becomes apparent that maybe a different diagnosis was more appropriate, then you rewrite all the educational documents and so on, and you move forward with the information you have at that point.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that added answer. The next question. So, communication is imperative to help reduce stigma, judgments, and assumptions. Having an open dialogue and interaction can break down the fear as well as bringing forward compassion, although the process is difficult. Oh, okay, so she was commenting, and one must utilize strong advocacy skills. So she was just commenting on the question before. Another comment.
I think that's a great
comment. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say I think that's a great comment. I remember a couple of years ago on Twitter, on one of the mental health discussion days that we have throughout the calendar year, I sent out a tweet saying that I lived with bipolar disorder, and I hit send, and immediately after I did it, I thought, yikes, should I have done that? And then I thought, absolutely, I should have done that. People need to know that you can do well in the universe and have a happy life and have a mental illness. And that I think that I had added fear because even though there has been a lot of talk very openly about living with depression, there hadn't been at that point as much open discussion about living with bipolar disorder. And we all know in this community there can be a lot of misassumptions and unkind comments and so on. And I thought, am I going to open myself up to all that? But you know what? People were overwhelmingly supportive. And now I feel like I don't have anything to hide. In fact, I can share on a daily basis the strategies that I'm using to live well with my diagnosis. So, sometimes when I get back from one of my power walks, I'll say, oh, that feels so good. And now I don't feel so anxious. And I can go on with my day. Because otherwise, how are other people who are new to the diagnosis or who have a family member who's new to the diagnosis, how are they going to know what works or see models of people in the world actually having a great life?
Yes, great point. Thank you for sharing that. There's another comment that you look fantastic and your writing has always been a source of support for me. Can't thank you enough for this book. She's thrilled to hear that your children have found their passions in life and are happy, and it provides her focus and reminds her that she needs to be her son's advocate and #1 fan. So that was a very nice comment.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you very much, lovely person.
Okay, it looks like that's it for the questions for now. So I just, again, wanted to thank you, Anne, for sharing your personal story and for being an advocate and helping others through these difficult times. And I'm sure, again, if anybody has any additional questions, please send them to my email and or Anne's, as you see here. And
Yep, I go back.
and lastly, just again to remind you that this will be archived on our website this afternoon. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Debbie, for being a wonderful moderator, and thank you to everybody who took time to participate in this and to share their insights. I so appreciate it.
Wonderful. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.